Chuck Schuldiner was a name that would come to define death metal, a genre that, before his influence, was raw, chaotic, and unrefined. Through his artistry, Chuck elevated death metal into something transcendent, infusing it with melodic complexity, philosophical depth, and technical innovation. Not just a musician, Chuck became a symbol of resilience, authenticity, and the pursuit of musical freedom. But who was Chuck, really? Beyond the heavy riffs, the guttural growls, and the philosophical lyrics, Chuck was a son, a brother, and a man who lived with passion and purpose. His legacy lives on through the power of his music, but his journey as a human being remains just as compelling. Born on May 13, 1967, in Glen Cove, New York, Chuck's family lived in a culturally rich environment that fostered creativity. His mother, Jane, a former piano player, ensured that Chuck was exposed to music early in life. Chuck's father, Mal, a stoic man and a Holocaust survivor, instilled in him a strong sense of resilience, which would become one of Chuck's defining qualities throughout his life. The Schuldiner household was filled with music from various genres, from jazz to classical, offering Chuck a broad canvas of influences. At the age of 9, after the family's relocation to Altamonte Springs, Florida, tragedy struck when Chuck's older brother, Frank, died in a car accident. Frank was a source of inspiration for Chuck, and his death profoundly affected him. Chuck's grief led him to music as a way of coping, and his parents, understanding the importance of creative expression, bought him his first guitar. It was Chuck's older brother's passing that formed the thematic core of much of Chuck's later work. Death, loss, and the fragility of life became prominent themes in his music, and these early experiences shaped his philosophical outlook, influencing everything from his songwriting to the way he lived. One story that has been shared by those closest to him, including family members, is how Chuck would often write songs in an attempt to process his grief. Even in his teenage years, Chuck would play his guitar late into the night, trying to work through his emotions. His early songs were often personal reflections, capturing the pain of loss and the yearning for answers to life's big questions. Those early expressions of pain evolved into the raw, powerful music that would later define death. In his teenage years, Chuck immersed himself in the burgeoning world of heavy metal. Bands like Black Sabbath and Judas Priest captured his imagination with their heavy, distorted sounds. Chuck's early guitar playing was shaped by listening to albums like Sad Wings of Destiny and Heaven and Hell. As he grew older, Chuck became increasingly drawn to more extreme forms of music, particularly the speed and aggression of thrash metal. Slayer's Reign in Blood and Venom's black metal were pivotal in expanding Chuck's musical palette. He would later cite these bands as foundational influences on his approach to death metal, which combined aggression with a level of technical proficiency previously unheard of in extreme music. Chuck's involvement with the local Florida scene began in the mid-1980s, and it was here that he formed the band Mantas. Initially a thrash metal outfit, Mantas laid the groundwork for what would later evolve into Death, the name signifying Chuck's preoccupation with mortality and the existential questions that intrigued him from a young age. In the local Florida scene, Chuck's devotion to his craft was already becoming evident. He was known for practicing relentlessly, always seeking to improve his skills. It was through this drive that he began to form relationships with other musicians in the area, including Rick Ross, who would become an early member of Death. Even in the early stages of Mantas, Chuck was determined to take metal in a new direction, one that would blend technicality, melody, and raw aggression into a cohesive vision. Death's debut album, Scream Bloody Gore, 1987, recorded in 1987, is often regarded as the first true death metal album. It was crude, raw, and brutal, but it also carried a sense of purpose. Songs like Zombie Ritual and Evil Dead helped define death metal's early sound: fierce, unapologetic, and most importantly, original. Yet Chuck wasn't content with just following the conventions of the genre. He was determined to push the boundaries of what death metal could be. Death's sophomore album, Leprosy, 1988, incorporated more complex guitar work, marking a significant shift in the band's sound. Chuck began to develop his signature style of complex riffing, intertwining melodies with aggression and raw technicality. While Leprosy still embraced the brutality of death metal, Chuck began to experiment with the genre, blending it with elements of thrash and even classical music. By Spiritual Healing, 1990, Chuck was no longer just concerned with pushing musical limits. He wanted to explore deeper, more personal themes. This was the moment when Death transitioned from being a band about gore and violence to a vehicle for Chuck's philosophical and existential questions. Interestingly, Chuck was known for being very particular about the recording process. He was often involved in every detail, from the way the guitars were tuned to the smallest nuances in the drum tracks. Producer Scott Burns, who worked on many of Death's albums, recalls how Chuck would sometimes spend hours perfecting a single guitar passage. Chuck had this incredible work ethic. He would stay in the studio long after everyone else had left, perfecting his parts. It wasn't about ego, it was about making the music sound exactly the way he envisioned it. As Death continued to evolve, so did Chuck's songwriting. By Human, 1991, Chuck had moved beyond the confines of death metal's gore-obsessed roots, choosing to focus on themes of introspection, self-exploration, and existentialism. Chuck's collaboration with musicians like Paul Masvidal and Sean Reinert of Cynic brought a new level of technicality to Death's sound, blending jazz fusion with death metal, something that had never been done before. I've always tried to write music that spoke to me. If it spoke to other people, great. But it was more about my own emotional release, Chuck once said. The album Human symbolized this. The lyrics delved into questions of the human condition, the struggle for self-realization, and the uncertainties of life. Tracks like Lack of Comprehension and Suicide Machine revealed Chuck's evolving interest in psychology and philosophy. Chuck's pursuit of a deeper understanding of the human experience was reflected in his evolving music. During the recording of Human, Chuck was reportedly deeply engaged in philosophical discussions with his bandmates, asking questions like, "What makes us who we are? How do we cope with suffering?" These conversations became the foundation for the album's lyrics, which explored psychological themes, the struggle of the self, and the complexities of human nature. It was clear that Chuck was no longer just writing about death and horror. He was exploring the intricacies of the human psyche. Chuck's life outside of music was just as rich and multifaceted as his career. His devotion to his family was apparent, especially when speaking of his mother, Jane, who had always been his biggest supporter. She was the one who encouraged him to continue playing guitar after his early frustrations, and Chuck would often express his gratitude for her unwavering belief in his abilities. In a rare interview, Chuck spoke about his love for animals, particularly his affinity for cats. He once said, "I've always felt a deep connection to animals, especially cats. They're independent but loving, which is kind of how I see myself." Outside of music, Chuck found peace in nature, often taking long walks through the Florida wilderness. Those who knew him describe him as a man of humility, always approachable, and ready to offer kind words of encouragement. One story from fellow musician Paul Masvidal of Cynic perfectly encapsulates Chuck's humility. Chuck was a rock star, sure, but he never acted like one. He was humble, thoughtful, and an amazing friend. His influence on us was so profound, not just in music, but in how to live with integrity. Chuck also became known for his interest in martial arts, particularly Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. His love for the discipline wasn't just about physical prowess, but also the mental clarity and focus it provided him. During some of his last years, Chuck would talk to friends about how martial arts taught him discipline and patience, qualities that he applied both in music and life. By the late 1990s, Chuck felt the need to step beyond the boundaries of death metal and explore new musical territory. This desire led to the creation of Control Denied, a progressive metal project that allowed him to experiment with more melodic and clean vocals. The band's debut album, The Fragile Art of Existence, 1999, was a shift in direction from Death's more aggressive roots, showcasing Chuck's ability to craft intricate compositions with soaring melodies. Songs like Breaking the Broken and Consumed blended progressive rock, jazz, and even classical influences. Fans were stunned by the depth and complexity of the album, and it solidified Chuck's reputation as one of the most innovative minds in metal. In 1999, Chuck was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of brain cancer, pontine glioma. News of the diagnosis shook the metal community, but Chuck, true to his nature, faced it with grace and determination. Despite his diagnosis, he continued to write and record music, refusing to let the illness halt his creative process. During his treatment, fans and fellow musicians rallied to support Chuck. Benefit concerts were held to raise funds for his medical expenses, with bands like Cannibal Corpse and Obituary performing to honor his legacy. Chuck's response to the outpouring of love was one of humility. In an interview before his passing, he remarked, "I'm thankful for the support, but I want people to know that I'm at peace. The fans gave me so much joy, and I just want to give that back." Though Chuck passed away on December 13th, 2001, at the age of 34, his legacy is far from over. The impact he had on death metal and the broader heavy metal community cannot be overstated. Chuck didn't just create music, he created an ethos, a philosophy that transcended genre boundaries. Bands like Obituary, Atheist, and Morbid Angel cite Chuck as a direct influence, and his work continues to inspire musicians across genres. One of Chuck's closest friends, Paul Masvidal, said in an interview after Chuck's passing, "Chuck was the kind of person who didn't just inspire you to be a better musician, he inspired you to be a better human being. His music and his legacy live on in every note we play." Chuck's influence extends far beyond music. He shaped the way we think about life, death, and everything in between. His fearless approach to both art and existence changed the course of metal and made him an enduring figure in the annals of rock history. Chuck once said, "At the end of the day, it's all about expression and about making something that resonates with people." And that's exactly what he did. Through the thunderous riffs, the thought-provoking lyrics, and the raw emotional intensity of his music, Chuck Schuldiner created something that will resonate for generations to come.